Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Lisa Lewis and Melinda Wenner Moyer. FAN is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, families, and individuals from across the country. We are deeply committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. Please subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our 40th anniversary season of programming. It's a big one. And now for some introductions. Lisa Lewis is a freelance journalist who covers the intersection of parenting, public health, and education. Her book, The Sleep-Deprived Teen, Why Our Teenagers Are So Tired and How Parents and Schools Can Help Them Thrive, is an outgrowth of her previous work on the topic, including her role helping get California's landmark law on healthy school start times passed. Ms. Lewis has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Los Angeles Times, among others. Melinda Wenner Moyer is an award-winning science journalist, professional speaker, and author. We hope to bring her back. She writes the weekly Well newsletter for the New York Times, is a contributing editor at Scientific American magazine, and is a faculty member at New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. And now let's welcome Lisa Lewis and Melinda Wenner Moyer.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. Lisa, I am very excited to talk to you and to learn from you tonight, because this is such a hugely important issue. I read Lisa's book when it first came out, and I actually interviewed her for my parenting newsletter. And honestly, I thought I knew a lot about sleep from my health and science reporting, but I learned so much from your book. And it is hugely relevant for me right now, because my 11-year-old has to get up at 6 a.m. now to catch the bus. He's just started 6th grade and everything starts earlier, and it is a nightmare. And today he fell back asleep after we woke him up. So it's just really hard to see him in this perpetual state of new sleep deprivation. So I am very excited to learn what I can do, what we can all do to help our teens and tweens sleep more.
Yes. I know you and I have talked a bit offline about this, and it is such a huge issue for so many of our tweens and teens. It really, really is.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. So I want to start by asking you a little bit about your backstory. Why did you write The Sleep-Deprived Teen? What inspired you? What made you care about this issue?
Yes. So I am a parenting journalist. I'm also a parent, and this issue hit our household a few years earlier than it hit yours, because my oldest started high school in 2015. So that for me was when this really became something that was impacting us, and turned into an issue that for me just sort of snowballed from there. So I have been immersed in this for the last 7 years. So it does all date back to August 2015, because that was the specific month that he started his freshman year of high school. And at that point, our local public high school started at 7:30 in the morning. And that just was incredibly early. It was the earliest he had ever had to go to school, in all the grades and all the different levels that he'd gone through. And it was also really obvious really quickly that it was just too early for him. I was the one driving him to school. We were leaving the house every day at 7:10, and he was sort of dutifully, getting in the car and sitting there, and he was pretty quiet and reserved because he was still half asleep. And I could just tell it just felt wrong, depositing him off for a full day of learning. This kid who was hardly alert, and that anyone say, yes, he's really ready to go for a full day of school. So of course I put on my journalism hat and I started looking into this, trying to figure out, why does our school start so early? And I quickly found out a few things. The first was, it had been that way as long as anybody could remember in our small community where I live. 7:30 was the time people my age had remembered having gone to the local high school, and that's what time it had started. I mean, it went back for years. So this was just an entrenched start time. But what I also found out was that it wasn't just our community that had this early start time. This was actually happening in so many other communities around the country. And 7:30 obviously is early, but there are schools even today that still start even earlier. There were some that had 7 a.m. as their first period mandatory start time. So it was clear this was a huge issue. But the other key piece was that 2015 happened to be a time where it was fortuitous that I tapped into it because it happened to be reaching a critical mass. The previous year, 2014, was when the American Academy of Pediatrics had released their very influential policy statement on school start times, recommending that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 because of the impact that these too early start times have on our kids' sleep and all of those ramifications. So it really was fortuitous that was when I was getting involved. It really was an issue that had been around for some time, but really was gaining steam. But I started writing about it. I think my first articles came out my son's freshman year. But then there was one article that came out at the beginning of his sophomore year. So this would have been 2016. It was an op-ed that ran in the Los Angeles Times, and it was called "Why Schools Should Start Later in the Day." And that ended up being read by one of our California state senators. He literally read it in the newspaper, and it resonated with him because at that point, his daughter was starting her freshman year of high school. And as it turned out, their high school was actually having conversations about whether to move to a later start time. So this issue resonated with him. He decided to look into the issue further. He quickly tapped into an information source that I also had tapped into. It's a group called Start School Later. It's a national nonprofit. It's been around since 2011. In fact, I was writing about it, but I was also trying to make a difference locally. So after I'd found out about them, I decided, I'm going to start a local chapter. So I had done that here. Well, meanwhile, his office reaches out to Start School Later. They're based in Maryland. They, in turn, looped all of us in California who were local chapter leaders. So I actually found out about this bill even before it was officially introduced. And then it just sort of snowballed from there. So the bill, now law, was introduced in February of 2017, made national news because there have been countless bills introduced, but this was California, obviously the most populous state, one that is often a bellwether. So it was national news. It became a big, drawn-out process, 2.5 years. And I was involved in that from February 2017 until when it was signed into law, which was October 2019. And as an outgrowth of all of that, I ended up writing this book. So it was a journey.
Wow. Yeah, that's really amazing. Congratulations. That is quite a feat. And I hope that it has ramifications for the rest of the country and a lot of, and other states decide to do the same thing. But I imagine it was not easy. And I know there are a lot of misconceptions about teen sleep. And I imagine when you were trying to fight for later school start times, you heard some misconceptions over and over and over again. Can you tell us about, some of the biggest misconceptions that people have?
Yes, and it is true that there are a lot of misconceptions out there that people let's start with the amount of sleep teens need, because people always hear, 8 hours. 8 hours is sort of this mythical magic amount of sleep. Well, that's perfect for adults. The sleep range for us is 7 to 9 hours. But for teens, the official recommendation is 8 to 10 hours every single night. Those are the official recommendations from the National Sleep Foundation. And so I think sometimes people are surprised to hear that. Because it's so much easier to think, 8 hours, and then maybe they're getting 7.5 hours, and then before you know it, you're shaving off. And to really understand how sleep deprived they are, obviously you have to start with an understanding, how much sleep are they supposed to be getting? There's another key piece, and again, this is just some of the basic information that I think is so important to start with, which is that teens have a different circadian rhythm than they did when they were younger. So this shift happens at the onset of puberty. Basically, their body clock shift, their sleep schedule shifts later. And this makes intuitive sense. For those of us with kids, you see it. You see when you have little kids, they bound out of bed, 6 or 6:30 in the morning. And oh, I can still remember those years. And you just start thinking, are they ever going to sleep in? Are they always going to be, coming in and jumping on my bed at 6:30 in the morning? And of course, the answer is no, they won't always be doing that. And you see it because this circadian rhythm shift happens at puberty. Essentially what happens, sleep is a very complex process, but melatonin is the hormone that primes us to feel sleepy. And that begins to be released later in the evening. And it also doesn't subside until later in the morning. So our kids are no longer feeling sleepy as early as they used to. They're not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night. Although obviously there are many who aren't even going to bed anywhere close to that. But then melatonin doesn't subside until later in the morning, and that's why they also then are sleeping later than they used to. So then you just do the math. If they need 8 to 10 hours and they're not feeling sleepy until about 11 o'clock at night, if they have to be sitting at their desks at 7:30 or even 7, it makes it practically impossible for them to get the amount of sleep they need.
Wow. I'm all I can think about right now is the irony that the younger kids who like to get up early are starting school later than the kids who can't sleep, can't get up early and can't sleep until later. And I mean, it's just like, it's completely backwards.
It is. And in fact, I have a whole chapter about that. It's sort of looking at why do schools start so early when we're talking about middle and high schoolers. So I think the first thing to recognize is that this circadian rhythm shift, these later sleep schedules, only apply to adolescents. So they don't apply to our younger kids, our elementary schoolers. And yet, as you mentioned, the irony is a lot of these schedules that are in place, particularly when there are these staggered tiers of start times, have it the exact opposite. And really, those schedules are due to be updated. In many cases, they are what I call legacy schedules because they were put in place many years ago, in some cases literally decades ago, as a result of budget constraints. So districts that were looking to save money on buses decided they could consolidate, use one fleet of buses for the drop-offs and pickups for all 3 levels. But at that point, the research into adolescent sleep was not as widely known. So the default often was, oh, well, older kids, they should be better able to handle these early start times. And so that's what was put in place. And then, unfortunately, that's what has endured in far too many cases, even though now we know that if anything, it should literally be the opposite.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, that's so frustrating. So clearly, from what you said, there are a lot of teens who are not getting nearly enough sleep. What are the consequences of this? Why should we care so much about how much sleep teens are getting? Does it do more than just make them tired? I know it does. Can you walk me through what does this lead to?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, it's a great question because we sort of know that it's not good, but often to really understand exactly what that means, I think is so important in this discussion. So, well, the first thing actually I should mention is just to give people a sense. So we've talked about the 8 to 10 hours that teens should be getting. Well, the vast majority of teens are not getting anywhere near that amount. So data from the CDC from 2019, when they surveyed high schoolers, only 22% of high schoolers were even hitting that minimum of 8 hours a night. So just to give you a sense of the scope of this. And to your point, so why does that matter? And the answer is it matters basically for every single possible aspect you can think of. It matters for school because it affects learning. And that actually, there are 3 key ways it affects learning. And again, some of this, it makes intuitive sense when you think about it. When you are sleep deprived, it hampers your ability to acquire information. So when our kids are sitting there learning, they're at their desk, they're learning, you certainly don't want them falling asleep on their desks, which unfortunately often happens. But even if they're awake, if they're sleep deprived, they are not learning as well as they could be. Being sleep deprived also hampers the ability to retain that information because that whole process of knowledge consolidation happens while we're sleeping. That's when all of the new information and stimuli that we've taken in during the day is consolidated and interwoven with other bits of information we already knew and transferred from short-term into long-term storage. So all that is hampered if our teens aren't getting enough sleep. And then the third piece, again, just related to learning, is being able to retrieve that information. So they're trying to do their homework, trying to remember what it was that they learned in class that day, or taking a test, and trying to build on those concepts. So just from a learning standpoint, being sleep deprived really affects all those aspects. There are also so many ramifications too when you look at mental health. So for instance, anxiety, depression, suicidality, all of those are exacerbated by being sleep deprived. And we know just from especially what's gone on these last few years, mental health among our teens is not good to begin with. And then you layer in sleep deprivation, it really is even more worrisome. And then a third piece I'd like to mention is the fact that it affects risky behaviors. So when teens haven't gotten enough sleep, they are more prone to impulsive behaviors, and that has to do with their phase of brain development, that they're much more attuned to reward seeking and impulsivity. But that also includes things like substance use, and it also has public health implications because of things like driving. Drowsy driving is huge, even more of an issue when you're talking about a new driver out on the road.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So there's so many ways in which this lack of sleep is affecting teens. And can you expound a little on the mental health aspect? Like, do kids who get less sleep tend to be more likely to be depressed or anxious, or like, what are the mental health consequences?
Yeah, there is actually a dose response relationship. So for every hour of sleep, teen suicide risk goes up. So just some quick numbers. There was a study done in Fairfax County. Each hour of lost sleep was linked to a 42% increase in suicidal thoughts and a 58% increase in suicide attempts. So, I mean, that's just, as a parent, it just sends chills down your spine. The opposite, though, is also true, which is that getting more sleep is a way to lower teen suicide risk. So they have done studies on that as well. So that is, perhaps the silver lining there. But it just exacerbates if our teens are already having these symptoms. It also just makes everything that much harder, because if you have not gotten enough sleep, you're more reactive, you're more impulsive, you're more emotional. I mean, this is something as adults, this is something I know certainly for me. I'm a nicer person if I've gotten a good night's sleep. But when you layer that on for teens who already have all these other stressors, it lowers their emotional resiliency. They have less of an emotional buffer just to deal with all the daily stressors and everything that they have going on.
Wow. Okay. So I would love to shift toward what can we do about this, because clearly this is a huge problem. It's bigger than I ever knew. But at the same time, like my kid's only 11, but already he comes home from school, he's got homework, he's got, soccer practice, he's got intramurals that he does. I mean, there's so much to squeeze in every day. He wants to, have screen time. Like, how do we start helping our kids sleep more? How do we get it all done? How do we help them fall asleep? How do we deal with this?
How do we get it all done? If only I had the answer.
Yes, please, Lisa, tell me, how do we get it all done?
Yeah, I mean, but what you just described for your kid is so typical. I mean, in terms of just all of these things that they have on their plate. So well, there are several things I would say. And in the first, getting back to the school start times, we know that is the biggest policy change that can be made to help teens get more sleep. So if, to the extent that it's possible, if you are in a community or in a district where the schools do start too early, I would absolutely encourage getting involved to help try and change that, because that is the single biggest piece affecting what time they get up in the morning, is what time school starts. So absent that, though, we have to look at the other piece, which is nighttime. What time are they going to bed? And there are some pieces we can affect on that end. But again, the caveat being, if they have to get up at 6 a.m., well, they'd have to go to bed at 9 in order to get 9 hours sleep. And they're not necessarily sleepy at 9. So, I mean, you can put your kid in bed, you can put a teen in bed, but they are maybe just going to lay there and stare at the ceiling if you put them to bed at 9 o'clock. So, I mean, it only works to an extent. A few things I would say. The first is overscheduling. So this is one where it is just so easy to fall into this situation where by the time you add up everything that's going on, your teen may indeed have too much on their plate. So for this, the recommendation is literally just sit down with a piece of paper and try and figure out how much time, there's the time they're in school, but then how much time should they be allotting for homework for each of those various classes. And that can end up being quite significant, particularly if they're taking one or more honors level classes. And so to really sort of be realistic about how much additional time for homework for each of those classes, and then each of those additional activities, whether it is sports or club sports or band or speech and debate or drama or what have you, a job, just to write down how much time are each of those taking. And if you do all that and you see that there's not 8 to 10 hours left in the schedule for them to even have the window to have the opportunity to get enough sleep, it might be time to reevaluate. And again, that's easier said than done. I recognize that. It's straightforward to look at what it takes, but a lot of times our kids are taking these additional classes because they feel the pressure to do so. I mean, so this does touch into these larger issues, but that absolutely is a piece. So that would be the first one, is just looking at overscheduling. On a more immediate level, I would say looking at the evening time and trying to establish a wind down routine. Well, I should clarify, encouraging your teen to develop a wind down routine, because this is the things we did for our kids when they were little, in terms of, when you have a little kid and you read to them and you snuggle and, you give them a little juice or whatever, and it's this very set, sequence, and you have to be heavily involved. Well, obviously you're not going to be doing that with your teen, but that same general principle applies, because it's that transition time and having some sequence of activities that signals to you, okay, we are going to be winding down, we're calming down from all the busyness of the day and sort of easing into sleep. And what that includes is up to the individual. So it could be reading a book, an old school book. It could be taking a warm bath. It could be listening to a podcast, was one of the examples. One of the sleep specialists I spoke with was telling me she often encourages her patients, because you're not looking at the screen, but just listening, if that's something that helps relax you. So figuring out some sequence of events and sequence of activities and being consistent about that sort of helps you get into that mode and gives you a way to transition from all the go, you're on your computer, you can turn it off. Well, you can't just turn your brain off and fall right asleep. So that would be another big one. And then looking at tech, which I know is a huge issue, and we can talk more about that, but setting some sort of best practices for tech use in the house, which again, I know can be easier said than done, particularly if you have teens and you're suddenly deciding to do this. Ideally, you will have done this earlier on. But knowing that the best practice for tech, for instance, is no tech device use an hour before bedtime. Those are the official recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Ideally, not having devices in the bedrooms at night, having some sort of a central charging location. So that would be something to encourage. But for that too, the caveat is not just something that you ask your teens to do, that if that's the house rule, then the parents' devices get charged in a central location too. So it's, there's a lot of different ways we can try and impact what goes on in the evenings, because that piece we do have a little bit more control over than that morning piece.
Yeah. Okay. The wind down routines that you mentioned, can they help time the melatonin release a little earlier, or are you still going to come up, like, even if you have a really good wind down routine for your teen, are they still going to run up against that, like the melatonin just hasn't been released, he's not sleepy, or does it like help coax them to get sleepier if you have a good wind down routine?
That's a good question. My understanding is it's not going to change the timing of the release of melatonin. I mean, because that is
okay. Yeah.
logical. However, even though melatonin is released, if you're still feeling all revved up, you're not necessarily ready for bed. So it's helping ease that transition. Also, as an aside, since you mentioned melatonin, another question that I often get is, well, what about melatonin supplements? Because those are so widely available. And so, of course, that was one thing I wanted to ask about too, because basically when I was writing this book, I wanted it to be the resource I didn't have when my kid was starting high school, to find out the answer to all these questions. So the answer on melatonin is it's generally not recommended because it is a hormone that then you are supplementing. And the other key piece is it is not regulated by the FDA because it is not a prescription drug. And so you actually don't know that what it says on the label is exactly what is in it. You don't necessarily know what else is in it. But then also just getting back to the fact that, the dosage of melatonin is supplementing what your brain is already releasing. And that's kind of a tricky position to be in. So it isn't something to just take lightly that, because it's easily available, that must mean that it's safe. There's a lot of things that technically are natural, but when you dig into it a little and you start thinking, wait, that's a hormone that I am then supplementing. I mean, that does have implications.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I was wondering about that. So it sounds like there are things we can do to help our teens get more sleep, but at the same time, the best solution would be for schools to change their start times. So let's talk a little bit about, if you want to maybe try to encourage that to happen in your own community. And I will preface this by saying I have looked into this in my own district. I'm in a small district, so in theory, like maybe this isn't that hard to do, but I have come up against so many obstacles already with school buses, as you said, so yeah, if we change the start times to later, we need twice as many school buses and twice as many staff, and they share, I guess there's shared space issues, there's athletics. So what are the biggest obstacles you hear about, and how can parents start to try to, advocate for change and push against those obstacles in their own districts?
Yeah, it's great questions because it is sometimes tricky because there are other factors. This is all an interconnected system. Generally speaking, though, there are the same major issues that come up. Because I should mention to you, California has done this at the statewide level. We're the only state to have set any minimum time of how early is too early. But there are countless districts and communities around the country that have already changed their start times based on this research. I wish I had a number to give you, but there is no central database that tracks this. But anecdotally, I mean, it's hundreds that have changed from districts as small as a single high school, as you mentioned, to the city of Seattle. So, I mean, it has been done on all different levels. But the same kind of issues tend to come up. The first is inertia. Because anytime you talk about making a change, it's going to entail some inconvenience. And so often people just really don't want to have to do that. So that is probably far and away the biggest. But the other two major ones that do come up time and again are transportation and sports. And these are real. These are real logistical issues. But I get back to the fact that when we are looking at why this change is being proposed to later start times, it's not just being done because, it seems like a nice idea. It's being done because this is a public health issue. Teen sleep deprivation is indeed a public health issue. This is why every single group, it's not just the AAP, but after that, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the CDC, pretty much every major medical and public health group has come on board, also saying, yes, these later start times are what is recommended because of the implications that when schools start too early, the implications that has on teen sleep and all of these far-reaching ramifications. So helping people really understand the magnitude of this and that it is a public health issue, I think is the first place to start. A good analogy is if you were to think about going in to talk about why asbestos is bad in your district or why lead paint is bad. Well, people would acknowledge those are public health issues and they wouldn't say, but the buses, so it's sort of needing to really recognize the magnitude of what this is, which is that it is indeed a public health issue. And so I think that's one piece just to keep in mind so that it doesn't get derailed into only talking about buses or only talking about sports. That being said, those are real. I mean, these are real issues. When it comes to buses, we were touching on it earlier, there are so many cases where there is a tiered system in place. And so they can look at doing a flip, quite literally flipping, so that the elementary school kids are not starting at 9 anymore. The caveat, though, is you really don't want any kids starting at 7 in the morning. And unfortunately, these are things that have been put in place, frankly, for convenience and for budget. And something had to give. And what had to give was, health and safety issues, because that's really what sleep is. So sometimes it can be a flip. Sometimes it can be using transportation modeling software, which didn't exist 20 years ago when they put these systems in place, figuring out a better way to do it and rejiggering the system. Some districts don't offer bus transportation, so it's not an issue. So it sort of depends, because every community is going to have a different set of circumstances. So for transportation, I think that's the case. For sports, it's usually very, very similar. Everyone will say, oh, but what about the after school sports? And if you haven't, if the other schools around you haven't changed their times, well, then you're going to have to negotiate with them. So that's true. You do have to negotiate with them. That is the beauty of the statewide change, is that eliminates the need for that negotiation. But again, this has been done in so many different communities where you do have to have those conversations, but if you allow enough time to do it, you explain why it's being done. Particularly for sports, you can talk about the fact that sleep is a competitive advantage. I mean, this is known from the pros on down. So it's an issue, but it's also an issue that can be successfully addressed. And as you can tell, there's so much more I could say about it, but so much depends too on the specific details in the specific community. So you just sort of have to start there, see what the questions are, and just know that, more than likely, these are things that have come up and been successfully addressed already elsewhere.
Right. Okay. That's really helpful. I have wondered, I'm in New York, and there is a bill that is being introduced, I hear, and I don't know what the support is like for it, but I have wondered, well, is it going to be better for me to fight at the state level and call my representatives, or is it better for me to try to get my district to do it on its own? And I'm wondering, what did it take to get this law passed in California? How did that happen? How hard is that to do? Any thoughts you can share on if we want to do that in our own states, how can we do that?
Yeah, well, and that's a really good point, because New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts all do have active legislation right now that would set minimum allowed start times. And my fervent hope is that the fact that California has just done this is going to put a little wind in their sails. It has been tried in other states and hadn't passed up until now. But now this has happened. It is not only passed, but has gone into effect, because California's law went into effect on July 1st, and we are often a bellwether for other states. So I am really hoping that is going to help, give it a little push to get over the finish line. It's a good question. Like, where do you focus your efforts? I think it can be sometimes more effective to focus more narrowly, to focus locally. That is what I tried in my community. I will tell you, though, unfortunately, and this is also why I think legislation ultimately is the right approach. Unfortunately, if you are doing it locally, you are somewhat dependent on finding a sympathetic ear, somebody who's a superintendent or on the Board of Education who is on board with this, or who you meet with and quickly understands and is going to champion it. And if you have the opposite, which unfortunately can be the reality, it's going to make it a lot harder. It's going to make it much more of an uphill climb. And I will just say, candidly, that was what I was up against in my own district. It was sort of ironic. I had been writing about this. I came in with all the information in our particular situation, because again, every district has a different setup. There was a tiered system that had been put in place because of buses. The elementary schools at that point, the start time was anywhere between 7:45 and 8:10, because they did a little bit of staggering there. Then middle school started at 8:45, which is great. And then high school started at 7:30. So this hour and 15-minute, sudden change when kids are already making that transition to high school, obviously, made that even more difficult. But at the time that my son was starting high school, they had eliminated busing for the general student population at high schools because of budget. And yet we were still stuck with this 7:30 start time. So, I mean, quite honestly, it was a system where you couldn't even say, oh, well, at least it's being done for this reason. So you would have thought it would have been a slam dunk when I went in to talk to them about it, but they were not having it. And they dutifully met with me. This was the second superintendent. The first one didn't even respond to my email, but then she retired. Another one came on board. He delegated it to someone on his staff who met with me and made it very clear that yes, thank you for the information. And no, I'm sorry, we just don't think that that's going to work. So it was very obvious it was going to be an uphill climb had I stuck with that. And had this opportunity not suddenly come up with the statewide legislation, I probably would have continued down that path. In fact, I know I would have, because I was already in talks with a fellow parent who's a neurologist, and she was on board and we were going to be going in. So I do think that it can happen at the local level. It helps if you have an audience who's more amenable to it, a superintendent or somebody like that. But barring that, or even if you do have that, bringing in a medical expert is key. I think it just helps add that gravitas. And recognizing that it may be a lengthy process of communicating why this is important, addressing these concerns that come up, but not letting it get derailed by these logistical questions. So really helping people understand and continuing to bring it back to the public health underpinnings of why this is being proposed. So it's a tricky question. I don't know what to say, because in your situation, because I've been there, I would say you sort of want to the extent you can, in your copious free time, to do a little bit of both.
Right. Okay. Can you talk a bit more about how the law got passed in California and your efforts with that, and what the opposition was too? I'm curious.
Yeah, that was a journey. It really was. So as I mentioned, the bill first was introduced in February of 2017. And at that point, the bill as written required middle and high schools to start no earlier than 8:30 in the morning. And that bill immediately got national visibility, as I mentioned, and that included sudden responses from supporters, but also from those who opposed it. So in our case, the largest and far and away most visible group that opposed the bill was the CTA, the California Teachers Association, which is a huge and very powerful union in California. And essentially their position was that they understood the science, but that they did not like the idea of it not being decided by them locally. So it came down to local control and collective bargaining, which is not about student well-being, because the argument was essentially, yes, we understand that this is important, but we know best what's best for our local communities. And yet, a kid in any given community is still going to have these same basic sleep, biological underpinnings. None of them are magically able to get up at 6 in the morning and have it not affect them. So, it was a little distressing to see that. In fact, Senator Portantino, the state senator I mentioned who introduced this bill, basically said, these are people who are talking about adult interests, not about kids' well-being. And that's exactly what it was. On the other side, we had support from the California State PTA, which was tremendous, because they are all about kids' health and well-being. And when this bill came out and they looked at it and they could see very clearly, that that's what this was in support of. So they came out as a supporter. And then the second time the bill was introduced, they actually signed on as a co-sponsor. So Start School Later was one co-sponsor. The California State PTA was another one. And they are also a huge group in California. I looked it up. The California State PTA has about 750,000 members. So, again, just to give you a sense of the scope, but they were a key partner, and they're all about what's best for kids. So, it was very clear they didn't have an outside agenda, but the whole process was very lengthy. I mean, it truly was a journey. And I won't bore you with all the details, but basically it had to get through different committees and different hearings and different floor votes, then goes to the governor's desk, where bills are either signed into law or vetoed. So got through this whole process, 2017 into 2018 was the 2-year bill, gets to Governor Jerry Brown's desk, and he vetoed the bill. So it was back to square one. So, and the bill had officially reached the end of its 2-year lifespan. So Senator Portantino reintroduced it in 2019, had to go through that entire process again on both the Senate and the Assembly sides, the committees, the floor votes, the hearings, again, got all the way to the governor's desk. This time it was Governor Gavin Newsom. He is the one that signed it into law in October of 2019. And that, as it was signed into law, it was 8:30 or later for high schools, for public and charter high schools in California, 8 o'clock or later for public and charter middle schools in California. And that was a change that happened as part of this political process to allow additional flexibility for issues like transportation. I will just say, as somebody who had never been involved in the political process before, it was very eye-opening just to see how all of this happens. You know, I was up in Sacramento testifying in front of, one of these committees, one of these hearings, and just seeing what it takes to shepherd a bill through the whole process was incredibly eye-opening.
Wow. I have no idea what that's like, but thank you for volunteering all that time and expertise to make that happen. And I mean, I hope it is going to have, waves of effects throughout the country. So thank you so much for doing all of that.
Well, and it was not just me. I mean, obviously
I know
state senator was the one who shepherded it through all of the, this political process, but there was a team. I had other people like me throughout the state, but there were also a number of sleep experts throughout the country who were supporting us. So the woman who was the lead author of the AAP statement was writing letters of support, and countless other sleep experts and specialists. There was a consensus letter signed by about 125 of them from around the country in support of this. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who's from San Jose, was a strong supporter of this. She has introduced, I can't remember if it's the 5th or the 6th time, she just reintroduced a congressional act called the Z's to A's Act, which she first introduced in 1998. And this would be to direct Congress to study this issue, because Congress does not have jurisdiction over start times. But nevertheless, she has just reintroduced that act and has been championing this for decades, and she was also a strong supporter. So it really, truly was a multi-pronged team effort, and multi-year effort, I should say.
Yeah. Yes, sounds like it. Wow. I would love to go back to something we briefly touched upon earlier, which is technology and social media. I want to know a little bit more about how social media and devices and phones affect teen sleep, and how much of the problem are is due to them rather than anything else.
It's a good question. I mean, we know tech has infiltrated our lives. It is a vastly different landscape now than when I was growing up. I didn't need tech to do my homework. I could turn in a handwritten book report. No kid can do that anymore. They're turning in, professional quality PowerPoint presentations and everything. And that's just the world we live in now. So it's tricky because tech is so omnipresent. And so it's not just the social media piece, it's recognizing how much tech is embedded in schoolwork too, that our kids have to be online to do their assignments. In fact, there's one piece I was hesitating because I was just remembering there's one piece that I hadn't thought about, but makes perfect sense. When a teacher sets a due date for an assignment, often the system will default to 11:59 p.m. So, then your kid is saying, oh, well, I have until a minute before midnight to turn in. So that sort of tacitly encourages them to wait later to get started. So that is something that can be addressed, because some, people may not even realize that's just what the system sets. That's a pretty easy fix. Absent that, though, as parents, we can do our part to try and encourage kids not to wait to the last minute, but just kind of recognizing that they do have to be on tech for homework. So that's a valid piece of it. And there is also a lot of validity to their use of social media. I mean, it is a key part of our kids' social lives. The same way I used to spend hours on the telephone, well, kids now, they really do use social media for that, and recognizing that is part of the way that they stay in touch with their friends. So it does have its place, but putting some common sense guidelines in place. And again, this is a huge issue, and we could go on and on about this. But in fact, I have a whole chapter about tech in the book, just looking at some of these other factors at play. So we know that it's important for their social lives. It's a very important piece of that. It's part of their downtime, video games or watching a video or whatever, or what have you. However, all of those that they now do and have become so omnipresent have been designed to be as deliberately immersive as possible. So recognizing that piece too. I mean, as so first of all, the teen brain is primed for reward seeking. So all of those things that are built in, likes in social media or leveling up in a video game, those were specifically designed to play on that. So this is what we are up against and what our teens are up against. They're not just sort of willfully saying, well, I'm just going to be online. Like the devices are to an extent sucking them in. And it's the same for us. How many times have I meant to get off my phone? I've been scrolling and looking at the news and reading things. And before you know it, 45 minutes has gone by. Or you're streaming an episode of a show, and there's that little automatic countdown, so that if you don't do anything in 5 seconds, you're automatically watching the next episode, right? So all of this has been designed that way. So this is what we're up against. And so I think just recognizing some of that, just to set that as the base of understanding. And that's kind of why it is so difficult. But that's where then you get back to some of these best practices. Well, you do want, ideally, you and your kids to be off tech an hour before bedtime, the devices being somewhere else. It's interesting, though, because you hear all about blue light, right? Mm-hmm. And that is a piece of it, because often these backlit devices, they are emitting blue light, and blue light it helps make you feel more alert. So that's great in the morning, not so great in the evening. And so it's more of an issue if you've got your phone here as opposed to looking at a TV across the room. But it was, of the 3 main ways that tech use affects sleep, the people I spoke with all said it was the least important of those 3. It's important, but the 2 that were even played an even bigger role in impacting sleep were simply the time displacement factor. The fact that if you're playing video games till 2 a.m., you're cutting into your sleep time. But then also the fact that tech use is immersive and engaging. So, we talked about like video games, et cetera, but if you're on with your friend and you're going back and forth on chat about some argument that happened, and, all that riles you up. And so that piece can also make it very hard to just suddenly get off your device and go right to bed, because then your mind is swirling with things. So it just sort of recognizing, I guess, all of these factors, and recognizing we can't just sort of toss all the devices out the window. I mean, I wish we could put the genie back in the bottle, but, it's here.
It's a different world than when we grew up. That is for sure. Yeah, it's really complicated. And I'm constantly on my phone right before bed, and then I'm like, what am I doing? So, I mean, I can only imagine when you're a teen and it's, you don't have the impulse control too, that you hopefully have as an adult. It's just so much harder to put down your phone, to put down your device.
Exactly. And that's why, when these things that were deliberately designed to be as immersive, they're doing a great job of sucking them in. But that's why if you've got these guidelines set when your kids are little, it's that much easier as they get older. If you haven't perhaps had these guidelines in place, it becomes probably more of a discussion and a dialogue with your teens. And having their buy-in, I think, is so important, because it can be a case where you can discuss with them, your own challenges that you've had with tech. It can be even if you can't get the device necessarily out of their room in a smooth, artful way, it's asking them, well, just try if you put it on the other side of the room and see, did you sleep any better? At a minimum, having them turn off notifications. You would be surprised. I mean, how many people get back on their phones in the middle of the night when they wake up? So, those devices, they're constantly trying to remind you, I'm here, come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about one other opposite, like a claim that I hear, that I've heard when people talk about shifting start times later, and I would love for you to address it, which is, well, if we shift the school start time an hour later, then my kid's just going to stay up an hour later. Like, it's not actually going to help them get any more sleep. Is that true, or is that a myth?
Well, research shows that when schools move to later start times, kids do get more sleep. So it is not exact, 60-minute shift equals 60 minutes more sleep. They do stay up slightly later in the evening, but they more than make up for it with the additional sleep that they're able to get in the morning. So one of the most recent examples actually was Cherry Creek, which is a suburb of Denver. And it's a pretty large district. They've got 55,000 kids. They switched their start times in 2017. And at that point, high schools had been starting at 7:10, and they switched to 8:20. And after 2 years, they went back and they checked. And what they found was that kids were getting about 45 to 50 minutes more sleep each night.
Wow.
So that's one of the more recent examples, but this has been found time and again, because this has been done in so many different communities over the last several decades. So we do know that happily teens do get more sleep in general, and that most of that does come in the morning.
Okay, that is very good. I'm going to keep this in my brain for the next time somebody says that to me, because I've heard that claim and I'm like, oh, I wish I had the data.
That's
There are data.
Creek, Seattle. Yeah.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. So you have a chapter in your book about how not all teens sleep the same. So I know we've been talking about teens as this like monolithic entity so far, but that's not really true. And there's some equity issues here too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's true. There are a lot of other complicating factors that do exist for many teens that are above and beyond sort of all these sort of base level complexities that we've talked about. So the first has to do with biological sex. So biological females tend to sleep worse than males. And this happens at puberty, where suddenly they start to see this difference. And I spoke with, one of the leading researchers on female sleep. She said, yes, it really is up until puberty, you don't see differences, but at puberty, they do start to diverge, where females tend to have a higher risk of insomnia and also to take longer to fall asleep. So, yeah, that's true. The other huge piece is the impact of the menstrual cycle. So, up to 93% of teen girls say that they get cramps in the US, and that's, mild to severe cramps. So obviously that affects sleep. PMS affects sleep. And just again, when you think of the scope of this, about half of US girls have gotten their period by age 12. So this is a regular occurrence, and for some girls and women, it is severe. And of course, that does impact your sleep. And hormones are a powerful thing. Even once you're out of your childbearing years, you still have the impacts of hormones, unfortunately, on your sleep. So that is a reality that is just another complicating factor. Similarly, teens who identify as LGBTQ tend to sleep worse than their counterparts. And this is also, just in terms of the magnitude, a Gallup poll earlier this year showed that more than 20% of the Gen Z respondents do identify as LGBTQ. So that's the largest of any of the groups. And that cohort, that piece of Gen Z, is the 18 to 24-year-olds, because this was adults 18 and up. So it may continue to grow as more of those, in terms of the Gallup poll results, as more of those kids hit age 18. But recognizing that often they do sleep worse than their peers. unfortunately, in large part due to stress and discrimination, and that can affect sleep. Same thing when you look at teens of color are disproportionately likely to sleep poorly. A lot of that too can tend to be based on discrimination. Everything from microaggressions on up, these take a cumulative toll. The effect of that on sleep is something that has been documented, but there are also longer term effects, epigenetic effects. So essentially the legacy of discrimination that's been handed down, that is also a factor. And again, I'm sort of greatly oversimplifying a lot of this here because these are all huge areas. And I have a chapter in the book just because I think it's so important for parents to be aware of all of these, but each of these are huge topics, in and of themselves. But just to be aware that these are additional complicating factors. And then the last one to mention too is the effects of poverty and neighborhood. Because if you live somewhere where it's noisy or it's crowded or you don't feel safe or you've gone to bed hungry, that's going to impact your ability to get a good night's sleep. And then, of course, a teen can be in more than one of those categories and have multiple complicating factors affecting their sleep. And sort of recognizing then that when you don't get enough sleep, let's say you've had to deal with some sort of incident of discrimination, it affects your ability to get a good night's sleep. And then you don't get a good night's sleep, and then you are even less well prepared because sleep affects your emotional resiliency and your ability to bounce back after that. So it just can turn into a cycle.
Wow.
Okay, well, boy, that was there's a whole bunch right there, especially in that last 5 minutes. Just it felt like we went through like 3 additional hours, could be 3 additional hours of content. Melinda, thank you so much for your interview of Lisa. I want to remind everyone that we're going to do an after hours that's going to begin in about 7:58 right now Central. So it's going to begin in about 7 minutes. We're going to give Lisa and Melinda both a break, a 5-minute break when we finish this Zoom right here. The way to get to after hours, buy a copy of the Sleep-Deprived Teen. We've been putting links in chat. Come join us, ask your own questions. Lisa, as you can see, is a fountain of information and research. She has spent her time with this topic clearly, and it's a topic she's passionate about. So come join us. I'll pose one question. There were no questions actually from the attendees, which is a little unusual. But I'm pulling something that had come in before and just kind of wondering, my guess is some folks might want to know, and if you could, we only have about 2 minutes left. If you're a parent and your child is, you're wondering if your child has disturbed sleep in some ways, it is not, it's distorted sleep. Maybe it's something where, how do you know if it's time to go speak with a doctor as opposed to just my kid's just being a teenager? I didn't know if you had maybe any quick tips for parents about assessing that. And I know you're not a therapist, so
yeah, I was just going to say, I am not a medical expert. So just for the audience to be aware, I would say, but again, this was something I specifically have in the book. How do you know when it's time to consult a specialist? So when it comes to things like insomnia, the general rule of thumb is if it's 3 or more days a week and it's been at least 3 months that this is going on, then yes, it probably is time to raise it to a medical expert. If you go into your healthcare provider, they may refer you to a sleep specialist. There are other complicating factors, things like sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome that can affect sleep. And that then affects sleep quality. So we've been talking about sleep quantity because by and large, our kids just are not getting enough sleep. And because so much of that has to do with, school start times. But these other issues of sleep quality absolutely can affect sleep too, because you can be in bed for what seems like a long period of time, but you may be having these micro sleeps, and that really affects refresh.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that answer. Okay, so we're at 8 o'clock. We're going to close out the Zoom. We hope to see everybody. If you're in the Chicago area and you want to come to some of our in-person events next week with Becky Kennedy, hope to see you there. But we're still doing a ton of stuff on Zoom for the rest of our season. So have no fear. Lots of Zoom still left to come. Melinda, thank you. We'll see you in about 5 minutes. Lisa, thanks as well. Good night, everybody, and have a good end of your week.